Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fourth and final lecture for the Speedy Summer course. Today, we're going to be discussing global war and the global aftermath. We'll be looking at World War II and we'll be looking at the Cold War. We will be spending a little bit of extra time discussing how those two events affected Latin America, just to give this lecture a little bit of a more narrow focus because this content is so overarching in nature. So let's get going. As usual, our course logistics, y'all need to submit our Unit 4 reading reflections by the last day of the unit. By now, you should have submitted both of your history and detail videos, and you should also be working on your object and focus report. Remember that object and focus report is due by the last day of the summer B term, okay? Instructions, information, for both the history and detail videos and the objects and focus reports can be found on Brightspace. So let's move on. Again, we have our usual note on lectures. We are synthesizing information. We are not sort of discussing all of it. So it's compatible to your textbooks, but it's not comprehensive. You guys should use your lecture notes, your lecture guides, your reading reflections together to get an overall understanding of the unit. So what is today's agenda? We are going to talk about the post-World War I war, see how things shift and change. We are then going to move on to the rise of World War II, how that leads to the Cold War, look at the Cold War on a global scale, and then think about the legacies of the Cold War as we move to the end of the 20th century. So we sort of finished off last unit with the end of World War I. So what happens after that? With the destruction of World War I, this idea of European superiority is really shattered, right? Europe is in shambles right now. So all of this, like, centuries long sense that Europe was superior to the Americas, to Asia, to Africa, is in many very real ways shattered by this sheer destruction. And there's really a growing sense of both disappointment and discontent amongst Europeans and Americans. So there's this sort of idea that, you know, disillusionment, right? Following the intense violence of World War I. This is, in many ways, was the largest scale violence and war that really had been experienced in sort of modern history. So post World War One, a positive is many democratic countries start to extend the right to vote to previously disenfranchised groups. This can include women, as well. But of course, there is backlash, and intellectuals begin to turn on democracy as it expands to incorporate more people, to say it's quote unquote the tyranny of the average person, meaning that the average person has too much say, too much control over events and over what's happening, that they are now a tyrant. At the same time, there is significant scientific progress that is coming out of this post-war period. In particular, we have Albert Einstein, and he is really most well known for his theory of relativity, which, narrowing it down to layman's terms, right? The theory of relativity we can think of as sort of expanding and determining that there are rules that govern the way that things move and interact together. Now, it's much more complicated in science, but I recommend you take a science class to learn the details about theory of relativity. What we can say is it has a very fundamental impact on the political and social understanding of the world around us, and has a very sort of widespread um, impact on not just the scientific community, but general society. At the same time, we have Werner Heisenberg, and he comes up with the uncertainty principle, which is that there is an inherent uncertainty in the act of measuring a variable of a particle, right? So we are now moving a step further into understanding the world around us. There is that idea of that sheer destruction of World War I, trying to understand what happened, trying to understand who we are, trying to understand sort of how the world works. And this is how these two key theories are really developing. Despite sort of gains in the scientific world, there is the rise of a global depression. So the global economy had really returned to normal by the mid 20s following World War One, but its success was very fragile. And that results in the crash of 1929, where sort of this success of particularly the US economy following World War One really results in people getting a little bit more riskier in their speculations and their investments. They're like, things are going great. We can do a little more danger in our economic decisions. But ultimately that results in sort of a massive financial crash. And fears of this economic slowdown lead to the mass selling of stocks that then result in sort of the market completely plummeting. This financial chaos will then lead to mass layoffs and global destabilization as Wall Street is trying to sort of recoup its foreign investments and trying to sort of, organize its own house using foreign money, right? So Wall Street has invested in foreign entities and foreign companies. And now it's like, okay, actually, I'd like those back because my house is on fire and I would like to have that money to, put that fire out. Because of this, there are international ramifications, right? These economic relationships on an international scale are really deteriorating throughout what we now know as the Great Depression. And there's the growth of economic nationalism. What this means is that a nation tries to become self sufficient by imposing tariffs on foreign goods. The idea is if you impose tariffs on foreign goods, that means they'll be more expensive. People want to buy goods that are produced domestically, and a nation can really become self sufficient and not have to import a ton of stuff. Now, what is the result of this? World production declines by more than 30% between 1929 and 1932. This further damages the global economy. So, although economic nationalism is meant, sort of develops out of attempts to stop this sort of economic chaos on an international level, what it really does is it makes it worse. And in response, less production, less jobs, less availability, governments try to limit female participation in the economy to quote unquote make room for the men who had lost their jobs. So, an economic sort of effect, economic destabilization and destruction, then has very clear social ramifications on the workforce, particularly in terms of male versus female laborers, right? So it is not just isolated within the economic sphere, but really does impact the social sphere as well by targeting sort of equality in the workplace and limiting female participation that had expanded after World War One. So let's engage with our first lecture question. Take a couple minutes, pause this video, and answer the question: what was the global impact of the failure of the U.S. economy during the Great Depression? I will take a couple minutes to pause here. Come back when you are ready to move forward. All right, so let's move past economic depression and despair and turn into threats to democracy. So, the global economy and its destruction due to capitalist policies really results in a general souring on democracy and doubt on its success. At this point in time, the United States is one of the primary sort of democracies on the global stage, and it was very fervently capitalist. So there's the idea if, democracy can lead to such a capitalist destruction, then is it really worth it? Is democracy worth it? Is capitalism worth it? And that results in the growth of different political and economic perspectives. Particularly, communism in Russia really, expands, develops, and takes a dramatic turn. Although, as we talked about in Unit 1, the Bolshevik Revolution was primarily socialist. It evolves into a communism. And with that, it turns into war communism. And what that means is the Russian government nationalizes all industries and seizes all private property, right? So no longer are there any private industries or private property. Everything is owned by the government. No one really owns anything. So it is quite an extreme understanding of communism. At the same time, perhaps more detrimentally, fascism is also on the rise in Western Europe. So this really means what fascism means is that it is really a far right, ultra nationalist ideology in reaction to democracy's failures, right? It will be very conservative, very authoritarian, and very focused on the nation first versus any other sort of foreign relations. So while all of that sort of political turmoil is developing throughout the world, Latin America is also undergoing a series of changes. Um, Up until the 1900s, the United States and Britain had really instituted a near constant amount of incursions to try to establish control over different parts of Latin America. And that, as you can imagine, results in very strong political and economic instability. So by the 1900s and after World War I, Latin American diplomats are increasingly sort of tired of this effort, of these actions, and they start, increasingly confronting the United States. In particular, in 1928, 13 different Latin American countries vote for a resolution that sort of condemns intervention on the part of the United States or Britain. After World War I, in addition to this, US citizens are becoming more knowledgeable and interested in Latin America. So they're starting to be more aware of what is sort of going on in that region, and what the US government has attempted for several years throughout Latin America. And there is a growth in increasingly anti-interventionist journalism. So not only is there sort of attempts to stop intervention on the part of Latin American diplomats, it's also coming from US citizens and it's also coming from journalists. So by the 1920s, there's sort of a shift in perspectives between the United States and Latin America. And in particular, the United States State Department really starts to increasingly staff its department with Spanish speaking personnel. You would think this would be sort of a no brainer. If you're engaging with Latin American diplomats, you should have people that speak Spanish, but it really doesn't come into popularity until the 1920s. At the same time, there are a growing number of boycotts in Latin America and a number of lost trade deals due to resentment of this like growing occupation, this growing interventionist attitude. So by 1927, US trade with Latin America is greater than Britain, Germany, and France combined. And this gives Latin America a larger bargaining chip, a larger sort of ability to make the United States hurt with boycotts, with lost trade deals. The US needs Latin America. They need Latin American business to maintain its economy. So, what happens? There is the establishment of the Good Neighbor Policy. So, on March 4th, 1933, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt outlines the new policy in his inaugural address. And he says, and I quote, "In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself and, because he does so, respects the rights of others." About a month later, he expands. "The essential qualities of a true Pan Americanism must be the same as those which constitute a good neighbor, namely, mutual understanding and, through such understanding, a sympathetic appreciation of the other's point of view." So this is quite a turn from sort of years of intervention, both politically and economically. It's now sort of taking a step back to this idea of creating a sense of mutual respect between the United States and Latin American countries. Now, FDR goes one step further and he starts to withdraw US troops. So in 1934, he abolishes the Platt Amendment in Cuba. Now, this had been established in 1901 after the Spanish American War, and it had previously basically authorized any US intervention in Cuba. By abolishing this amendment in 1934, FDR is really making a statement about the US's desire to withdraw from this interventionist perspective. On December of 1936, the US Secretary of State says there is no government need fear any intervention on the part of the United States under the Roosevelt administration. They really take this as a critical aspect of the Roosevelt government. And even further, the Roosevelt administration condemns, quote, intervention by one state in the internal or external affairs of another state and the forcible collection of pecuniary debts. meaning that they no longer support actual intervention because of either things happening internally or things happening externally, and they can no longer sort of intervene in Latin American countries to sort of collect debts that are owed to the United States. So it is quite a departure. Now, what are the realities of this good neighbor policy? Non-intervention really results in tolerance for the rise of dictators in the Caribbean and Central America. And by the end of the 1930s, as World War II is drawing near, Roosevelt focuses on securing the Western Hemisphere. So, although this is like a good idea at first, as World War II is becoming increasingly apparent, Roosevelt starts to shift his ideas and perspectives to really sort of like circling the wagons, right? And there are a number of inter-American conferences to establish military alliances with the United States against growing Axis powers, who are going to be Germany, Japan, and Italy. So let's talk about these sort of rumblings of war. In the 1930s, Japan, Germany, and Italy really engage in expansion attempts as a means to right perceived wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles and the global depression that followed it, right? So remember, last unit we talked about the Treaty of Versailles and how Central powers were not allowed to be at the Paris Peace Conference. So Allied powers were really allowed to take out all of their aggression, all of their vendettas and vengeance against the Central powers in a very intense way in the Treaty of Versailles. So Japan goes after China. Italy will go after Ethiopia, Libya, and Albania. And Germany will start with Austria and Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia. So they're going to start to sort of these powers are going to start to push back against the Treaty of Versailles. So let's move into, that will result, especially in Germany, on internal attacks on Jews, communists, and liberals, which we will talk about as we move into World War II. So here's a quick breakdown to World War II, right? Unfortunately, we cannot spend the most amount of time talking about World War II, but here's a quick guide, right? We can divide it into two powers. We've got the Allied powers. We've got France, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, which is newly communist Russia, and the United States. On the other hand, we have the Axis powers, which are Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan. So Nazi Germany invades Poland and France, among other territories, and it tries to invade Russia. At the same time, World War II was marked by the Holocaust, in which Hitler and Nazi Germany murder over 6 million Jews and 5 million prisoners of war in concentration camps. And to historians, World War II is one of the most impactful geopolitical moments in modern history, not only because of the sort of horrific death rates and the sort of intense murder of sort of Jews in concentration camps, prisoners of war, and the other groups that we will talk about in a couple of seconds, but also because it does result in the spread of sort of the Soviet Union and communism across Eastern Europe and China. And it will shift power away from Western Europe as the center of sort of global power towards the United States. So let's talk about World War II in North America. So throughout the war, German submarines sink oil tankers from Central America and the Caribbean. In February 1942, there is a German attack on the Caribbean island of Aruba. And more alarming to America and sort of the Western Hemisphere alliance, German and Japanese forces learn the technical weaknesses of the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal is one of the most important sort of shipping lanes that connects the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And German and Japanese forces try to build submarines and intend to target the locks that sort of allowed the Panama Canal to function. So fearing all of this, and also fearing Axis spies in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere in general, the United States pressures Latin American countries to deport or jail any Axis nationals. On January 1942, the Pan American Foreign Ministers issue Resolution 20. And this demands the forced placement of Japanese individuals in internment camps. Now, Cuba, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Mexico, among others, do house prisoners. But over 7,000 Germans, Japanese, and Italians in Latin America are shipped to U.S. internment camps. In the United States, there were a number of domestic internment camps throughout the entirety of World War II, in which primarily individuals of Japanese descent, but also including Germans, Japanese, and Italians, were held for the entirety of the war. So the 7,000 that were shipped from Latin America were sent to these internment camps. And the US does threaten unwilling countries with an economic boycott, thereby essentially forcing Latin American countries to expel or deport any individuals of sort of Axis nationality or Axis heritage, or ship them to United States internment camps. Now, again, we cannot spend that much time, unfortunately, on World War II, but it is imperative that we talk about the violence and atrocities that were committed throughout the war. So although Jews were Hitler's primary target, millions of Slavs, Roma, which are also known as, sort of formerly known as gypsies, so the Roma travelers, political prisoners, and captured resistance fighters are killed in Nazi concentration camps. And in total, there are approximately 17 million deaths, which include 6 million Jews, 7.8 million Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, 1.8 million Poles. So there is quite a astounding level of death and destruction throughout World War II. And in addition to this astronomical death count, it is one of the most destructive wars. Cities are flattened, there are widespread food shortages, there is economic destruction. So it is not only quite violent and atrocious in terms of the death count, but also in terms of the sheer destruction that you see across Europe, across the Pacific. So with the end of World War II, we enter into the Cold War period. And the Cold War is the period essentially from the end of World War II in 1945 to approximately 1989. It is characterized by open yet restricted hostilities between the United States and the Soviet Union, but really it is characterized between capitalism versus communism. And there are global connotations as both powers struggle for world influence. So let's talk about the logic of the Cold War. So US policies during the Cold War rely on the idea that the Soviet Union is trying to conquer the entire world. The US then would need to attempt to stop such gains through containment. So containment will be the primary policy throughout the entirety of the Cold War. Each side is trying to establish military superiority over the other with no clear end goal in sight. It is essentially the US versus the Soviet Union, who is sort of militarily superior. And the US feels that it must, quote, hold the line against any kind of communist advancement. So let's take a pause and talk through capitalism. We could do a review of capitalism. I know we talked about it in Unit 1, but let's give a little refresher. So again, it is that economic system in which a means of production are privately owned, right? Markets are determined by rates of production and income, and it is the most dominant form of economy in the Western world since at least the 16th century. So then what is communism? Well, it is a political and economic idea that attempts to end private property and a profit-based economy. We saw that with the establishment of war communism in Russia that we just talked about earlier in this PowerPoint. And it replaces public ownership. It replaces this private property and profit-based economy with public ownership and communal control of the major means of production and natural resources. So it is really essentially the formation of society without class divisions or government or private versus public divisions in terms of resources. So how does the Cold War take place in Latin America? Latin America really becomes a battleground for the United States and the Soviet Union. Fearing the quote unquote Soviet menace, the United States will collaborate with authoritarian regimes as long as they're anti communist. They will compel Latin American governments to stop leftist labor movements. They will compel Latin American governments to outlaw communist parties. And they will overthrow elected governments that appear quote unquote soft or remotely tolerant of communism. This approach will dominate US and Latin American relations from the 1950s to the 1980s. So, between that time, the United States attempts or succeeds in overthrowing a democratically elected government in the following countries, which is not all of them, but is some of them. We've got Cuba, we've got Guatemala, we've got Nicaragua, Chile, El Salvador, and other aspects, other parts of Latin America. So let's pause and engage with the lecture for the second time. Take a couple of seconds and answer this question. How did the Cold War impact countries other than the United States and the USSR? I will pause here, allow you to pause the video, and then we will come back. All right, so let's wrap up this Unit 4 lecture with our main takeaways, not only from this unit, but from the course in general. What is perhaps the most important is that the conclusion of World War II serves as a catalyst for the beginning of World War I. History is continuous. Events build upon each other. The Treaty of Versailles led to discontent amongst Central Powers, that led to resentment, that led to the sort of rise of leaders who promised change, that resulted in the rise of Hitler, that resulted in the rise of Mussolini in Italy, that resulted in World War II. It is important to understand the global impact of the end of World War II as the Cold War began and as sort of the United States and the Soviet Union really locked into decades of conflict that would draw in the rest of the world. It would draw in Asia, Latin America, and Europe. So it really had a global impact. And throughout this course, if you take anything away from this course, I want you to sort of understand that we have seen how history builds upon itself, right? We can tie events in Unit 1 to the events in Unit 4, right? We can talk about sort of the colonization of the New World, the rise of capitalism, the rise of industrialization, the rise of sort of, you know, the war economy in World War I, the sort of riskier speculations following World War I, the discontent at capitalism and democracy, the rise of communism, and then the rise of sort of the Cold War, just, you know, in one thread, right? We can see how every single event in history, particularly world history, everything is connected, everything is intertwined. And one event will have not only sort of an immediate impact, but also a sort of long-term impact, both locally and internationally. So go ahead and finish up all of your required aspects of Unit 4, get in your remaining assignments, and enjoy the rest of your day.